In 1980, a beloved small-town mail carrier vanished without a trace during his daily route, leaving behind only his idling truck and unanswered questions. 14 years later, a rusted mailbox no one could open is finally forced open on a remote property, revealing his missing mailbag and the chilling truth sealed inside. It was the kind of quiet that only settled over the farmlands of rural Missouri, where the hum of cicadas was the loudest sound for miles and the gravel roads stretched like faded ribbons between golden fields. On the morning of June 17, 1980, Douglas Rayner pulled his mail truck out of the Clyde Post Office parking lot like he had done every morning for the last 12 years. At 43, he was the kind of man people trusted instinctively. He remembered birthdays, delivered medicine in snowstorms, and even helped more than one elderly widow fill out Social Security forms on her porch. Everyone on Route 9 knew Douglas. He had a reputation for being punctual to the minute, organized to the letter, and kind without needing a reason. That morning, he had left his wife Marlene with a kiss and a promise to bring home a new bag of cat food. Their son Ty, still half asleep, gave him a lazy wave from the kitchen table. Douglas chuckled and said something about the heat setting in early. Nothing felt strange, nothing felt off. But sometime after 11:00 a.m., Douglas stopped being seen. By 3:00 p.m., a farmer spotted his truck idling at the edge of a cornfield just before the turn onto Barrett's Hollow Road. The door was ajar. The keys were still in the ignition. His thermos sat untouched in the cup holder. The canvas mail satchel he always slung over his shoulder was missing. Within an hour, deputies arrived. Bloodhounds were brought in. A search grid was drawn up. Neighbors spread out in lines, calling his name into the wind and praying it wasn't what it looked like. But the trail ended at a barbed wire fence behind the field. The dogs simply stopped, like he'd vanished into thin air. The town of Clyde didn't know what to do with a mystery like that. People clung to rumors and theories like they were life preservers. Some whispered about a robbery gone wrong, others talked about old grudges or cult activity out in the woods. A few said maybe Douglas had run off, overwhelmed by some hidden trouble. But those who knew him best, Marlene Ty, the other carriers at the post office, refused to believe it. He wouldn't abandon his route. He wouldn't abandon them. There was one stop on Douglas Rayner's route that always seemed a little different. A weathered old farmhouse tucked behind a wall of overgrown hedges, with a long gravel drive and a hand-built mailbox that didn't match the rest. Most mailboxes along Route 9 were the usual metal kind, dented and sun-faded, but this one was a strange, overbuilt thing made from thick planks of wood and reinforced with bolts that looked more suited for a safe than a mailbox. It belonged to an elderly brother and sister, Silas and Edna Kleiner, who lived alone and rarely left their property. Folks in town said the two had inherited the place from their parents and had barely changed a thing in 50 years. They didn't come into town much except for supplies, and when they did, they didn't talk much to anyone. Douglas had delivered to them for years, always leaving the mail in the box and rarely getting more than a nod in return. He'd told Marlene once that the place gave him the creeps, but he never missed their stop, not even in storms. That morning in June, neighbors confirmed they saw Douglas turn up their drive around mid-morning. A retired school teacher named Ruby Stokes, who lived a few fields over, spotted his truck heading that way from her kitchen window, but no one saw him leave. And when investigators knocked on the Kleiners' door later that evening, the siblings were tight-lipped. They claimed Douglas had never made it that far. When asked about the mail, they insisted he hadn't dropped any off. The box was locked, they said, and they'd lost the key years earlier. It had been like that for a long time, they added, so the mail usually just sat on a bench on their porch until they brought it inside. No one could remember when the mailbox had last been opened. Deputies asked to take a look inside, but the siblings refused, said it was private property. That was the end of that. The odd mailbox was noted in the case file, photographed once, and then forgotten. Over time, it faded into rumor. But for those closest to Douglas, that stop stayed sharp in memory. he had been there. Of that they were certain, and whatever happened next, it started at that box. The discovery of Douglas Rayner's truck set off a search effort that unfolded with rising urgency. Deputies from the county arrived before sunset, followed by volunteers with flashlights and dogs, all combing the nearby woods and surrounding fields. His route was mapped and retraced. Mail from earlier stops was accounted for, stacked neatly in the back of the truck, but his satchel, the one he always wore across his chest like a badge, was missing. Not stolen mail, just missing, like it had been deliberately taken. There were no signs of a struggle in or around the truck. No skid marks, no blood, no torn fabric, just his half-drunk thermos of coffee and a tin of butterscotch candies he always kept on the dash. It looked less like a crime scene and more like someone had stepped out for a minute and simply never returned. Dogs caught a scent from the cab and led their handlers down through a narrow cattle gate into the cornfields, noses low, tails high. But barely 10 yards in, they stopped. One turned in confused circles. The other sat down. Just like that, the trail went cold. Law enforcement brought in helicopters the next morning. Farmers allowed their land to be searched. Creeks were dredged, old wells reopened, but nothing turned up. No clothing, no tracks, no sign of Douglas anywhere. Word spread quickly, and soon everyone in Clyde had a theory. Some said he might have had a health episode and wandered off into the brush, but he was fit, and his medical file was clean. Others feared he'd been robbed or attacked by someone lying in wait, maybe a drifter hiding in the tree line, but Douglas's wallet was still in the truck, and there were no signs of another person. Within a week, FBI agents were brought in, though even they found nothing to suggest foul play or anything at all. It was like he had been erased. Marlene went on the local radio asking for help, her voice trembling but determined, urging anyone with even the smallest detail to come forward. Days became weeks, then months. And eventually, with no leads and no evidence, the case was quietly shelved. But back at the post office, his old locker was never reassigned. His nameplate stayed bolted to the top, as if someone still expected him to walk through the door. In the days that followed Douglas Rayner's disappearance, the town of Clyde entered a kind of stunned limbo. People went about their lives, but the absence sat heavy. Every porch along Route 9 left their flags down in quiet solidarity. At the post office, workers kept setting aside mail meant for Douglas's hands, unable to bring themselves to reroute it. It was as if acknowledging his absence would make it final. Rumors circled like dust devils. Some said he'd gotten mixed up with the wrong person. Others believed he'd been taken. A few, though quieter, insisted it was all too clean, too silent, to be random. Deputies conducted interviews with every household on the route. Most gave heartfelt statements about Douglas's reliability, his kindness, his daily smile. But when they returned to the Kleiner property, they met the same wall of silence. Silas answered the door, unshaven and visibly annoyed. He stuck to his original story, said the mailbox was locked, that they hadn't seen Douglas that day, and that they hadn't asked for any deliveries. Edna, who stood just behind him in the dim foyer, stared past the officers with a blankness that unsettled even seasoned investigators. When pressed again about the mailbox, Silas grew sharp. He insisted it hadn't been opened in years and that the key was lost long ago. The deputies asked if they could force it open, but Silas refused. He said they had no warrant, no cause, and no right to damage his property. And by the letter of the law, he wasn't wrong. With no physical evidence, no confession, and no direct witness, placing Douglas at the Kleiner home beyond a distant neighbor's vague recollection, the mailbox became little more than a footnote in the report. That locked box, with its rusting hinges and deep-set bolts, remained untouched. Over the years, it became a strange kind of fixture in local folklore. Teenagers dared each other to leave notes on it. Mail carriers hated it and stopped trying to deliver there altogether. People whispered that something was in it, but no one ever got close enough to find out. It sat like a sealed vault under a canopy of dying trees, holding something the wind could never carry away. Marlene Rayner never stopped marking the days. Every morning she took a red pen from the drawer beside the phone and made a single line through the square on the calendar. It was quiet, deliberate, and always done alone. The habit started the week Douglas disappeared, and she kept it going until there were no more empty squares. Then she'd hang a new one and start again. At first, she held out hope, thought maybe he'd hit his head, lost his memory, was wandering somewhere waiting to be found, but that faded. What remained was the ache of not knowing. Grief without a grave, loss without a name. Ty, their son, had been 15 when his father vanished. He'd spent that first summer riding his bike out along Route 9, scanning ditches and fence lines, half believing he might spot something everyone else had missed. But the silence that returned each night was crushing. As the years passed, he grew quiet too. By the time he turned 18, he left Clyde and didn't come back. Not for holidays, not for reunions. He sent cards sometimes, signed with love, but never with hope. Douglas's disappearance had carved something deep into both of them, not just the pain, but the way it lingered like fog, thick and hard to breathe. At the post office, Douglas's locker remained untouched. New hires came and went, but none ever asked for that spot. The brass nameplate stayed fixed above the door, dulled by time but never removed. His old co-workers still talked about him, usually in the break room, when someone new asked why there was an extra hook on the coat wall or an empty chair at the end of the carrier table. They always answered the same way. That was Douglas's. The town moved forward as towns do, slowly and unevenly. Theories turned into legends, and legends turned into silence. But every June someone would mention it in passing. A glance toward the fields, a low comment in the diner. 14 years would pass that way, marked not by answers, but by the steady erosion of questions. And through it all, that strange mailbox on the Kleiner property remained exactly where it had been locked, rusting and waiting in plain sight. By the early 1990s, most people in Clyde had stopped talking about the Rayner case. A few true believers, still lingered neighbors, who brought it up in hushed tones after church, or young deputies who combed through the old files when they thought no one was watching. But for the most part, life had moved on. The Kleiner house, long hidden behind its curtain of vines and tall grass, had gone quiet after Silas died in the fall of 1993. Edna followed not long after, and with no known relatives, the property was tied up in probate until the county took control. It was early spring when the auction signs went up. Hand-painted boards nailed to fence posts announced the date in thick black lettering, barely visible beneath layers of pollen and dust. Most people assumed the place would be a wreck inside, filled with mice and mold, and the odd antique worth hauling away. But one detail on the flyer caught the attention of Kendra Ames, a freelance journalist turned antique picker who had moved to northern Missouri a few months earlier. Buried in the fine print was a note. Mailbox believed to be original to property. Reinforced, lock, sealed. Something about that line stuck with her. On the day of the auction, Kendra arrived early. The house was every bit as weather-worn as expected, peeling siding, warped porch boards, windows dulled by time, but the mailbox was what drew her. It stood at the edge of the gravel path like a forgotten tombstone. The wood was swollen from rain and cracked along the bottom, but the lock, a thick brass cylinder, looked almost industrial. She ran her fingers over it, noting how the box seemed heavier than it should be. Inside, something shifted faintly. After placing the winning bid on the house, Kendra approached one of the auction staff and asked about the mailbox. He laughed and said nobody had been able to open it for as long as he could remember. No key, no luck. But something in Kendra's gut told her this wasn't just some forgotten parcel bin. She took a picture of the box, and, later that night, she called a locksmith. Whatever was inside had been waiting for a long time. She wanted to be there when it finally saw daylight. The locksmith arrived 2 days later. A middle-aged man named Ray Behrens, who had been working locks in rural counties since the late 70s. He drove a dented blue van and carried his tools in a heavy canvas bag that looked nearly as old as the mailbox itself. When Kendra pointed him to the post at the end of the gravel path, he squinted and gave a low whistle. Said it wasn't just locked, it was fortified. He ran a hand along the seams and muttered that someone had put serious thought into making sure nobody could get in without a fight. Kendra stood off to the side, arms crossed, notebook in hand. She wasn't sure what she expected, maybe some old mail, maybe nothing at all. But there was a stillness in the air that morning that made her chest feel tight. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. Ray worked in silence for a while, trying a few different picks before pulling out a small drill. As he positioned it over the keyhole, he asked casually if anyone had ever looked inside before. Kendra shook her head and told him what she knew, which wasn't much, just that the mailbox had belonged to the Kleiner siblings, who had refused to open it back when a mail carrier vanished in 1980. Ray paused with the drill in hand. His eyes flicked to hers, and the casual air seemed to thin a bit. He said he remembered that case. Everyone did. He'd been living 2 counties over at the time, but it had made the regional papers for weeks. A mailman who disappeared mid-route and was never found. He tapped the box lightly with his knuckles and said, half to himself, "You really think this thing's been locked since then?" Kendra didn't answer right away. She just nodded toward the drill. With a sigh, Ray powered it up. The sound echoed through the trees as steel ground against brass. It took longer than he expected. Whoever had installed the lock had reinforced it from the inside with overlapping brackets, like they were trying to keep something from getting out just as much as keeping people from getting in. And then, just before noon, the bit punched through. A faint metallic click followed. Ray stepped back and stared at the box, eyes narrowed. Something inside had shifted. And for the first time in 14 years, the door creaked open. The hinges groaned as the door slowly gave way, resisting just enough to make Kendra's skin prickle. Dust spilled out in a soft cloud, along with the faint scent of mildew and aged paper. Inside, slumped and curled like a sleeping animal, was a faded canvas mailbag. The once vibrant blue had dulled to gray, but the embroidered name stitched across the top was still legible, D. Rayner. Kendra didn't speak. Neither did Ray. For a long moment they both just stared at it, the weight of the name settling over the silence like fog rolling in from the trees. Kendra stepped forward and gently pulled the bag out, its fabric stiff from time and damp. A few brittle envelopes poked out the top, corners browned and curling, postmarks smeared with age. One by one, she set them aside on the hood of Ray's van, careful not to tear them, and then her hand brushed something thicker inside the bottom of the bag, something heavier than paper. She reached in and pulled out a sealed manila envelope, unmarked, yellowed, and sealed with tape that had cracked along the edges. But it wasn't just the bag. Tucked along the interior wall of the mailbox, jammed behind a panel that had been pried loose and forced back into place, were scraps of cloth. Strips of deep blue fabric with red trim postal uniform colors, unmistakable even through the years of grime. There was something else, too, a rusted metal badge pin. Kendra recognized it immediately from the photos she'd studied before the auction. The same style Douglas Rayner had worn on his collar in every image the paper had run during the search. Ray muttered that this was no forgotten mail stash. His voice was flat, like he already knew what came next. Kendra nodded without looking up. She was already thinking about the sheriff's department, about what they'd need to preserve the scene. She took one last glance into the box, and that was when she saw the dark discoloration along the wooden seam near the bottom, a stain that hadn't come from rain or rot. It had dried black and spread in jagged lines outward, the kind of mark left behind by something that should never have been sealed inside. The sheriff's department arrived within the hour. 2 deputies in marked cars rolled up the long drive, followed shortly by a crime scene technician in a dusty SUV with the county seal barely visible on the door. Kendra met them at the mailbox, already wrapped in yellow tape she'd brought from the supply box in her truck. She handed over the mailbag without a word. The moment one of the deputies read the stitched name, Everything shifted. It wasn't just an old property cleanup anymore. This was now the scene of a reopened investigation, one that had haunted the town in silence for over a decade. The technician knelt beside the mailbox, photographing every angle. Gloves went on. Evidence bags came out. The badge was placed in one, the cloth scraps in another. The dried stain was tested with a swab and carefully scraped for lab analysis. One deputy walked the perimeter with a notebook in hand, tracing boot prints through the grass as he made quiet calls back to the station. Kendra sat on the porch steps, watching it unfold with a hollow feeling in her chest. What started as a curiosity had turned into a cold current of something far heavier. By late afternoon, word had already started to spread. The mayor's office called. So did the regional postmaster, who promised to send someone out in the morning. Reporters from nearby towns began leaving messages at the county office. The past had come unburied, and it didn't take long for old names to surface. Douglas Rayner, Route 9, June 17th. The vanished mailman who was supposed to be just a story whispered by locals and remembered only by those who had loved him. Now he was headlines again. Back in the evidence van, the technician gently opened the sealed manila envelope found inside the bag. Inside was a single sheet of paper, carefully folded. No envelope, no address. Just a handwritten note in shaky, uneven script. It wasn't signed. But it was written in a tone both pleading and paranoid, referencing unseen watchers, threats through the mail, and something about betrayal from inside the house. The language was disjointed, the grammar broken, but one sentence stood out in clean, deliberate strokes. He knew what we were hiding. That was enough to reopen every file with Douglas Rayner's name on it. By the following morning, the old Kleiner property was lined with county cruisers and a few unmarked vehicles with government plates. Word had spread faster than anyone expected. Reporters hovered near the end of the gravel drive, held back by temporary barricades and a deputy who looked too young to be wearing a badge. Forensic teams moved between the porch and the mailbox with quiet urgency, photographing every inch, dusting for prints long faded, cataloging items that hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. Inside the house, another team began a slow, careful sweep of the rooms, unsure what else might have been hidden by two people who had kept so much to themselves. Neighbors from as far as 3 miles out began showing up, parking their trucks along the ditch and peering through binoculars, murmuring to one another like the past had cracked open and spilled across the lawn. Most of them remembered Douglas Rayner. Some had known him well, others had only known the smile he gave as he passed by. But all of them remembered the week he vanished, the empty truck by the cornfield, the unanswered questions. And now, with one lock broken, the questions had shifted. No longer where he went, but what he saw that someone didn't want delivered. Deputies confirmed the mailbag belonged to Douglas. The faded letters stitched into the canvas matched USPS records from 1980. The badge, the scraps of uniform, and the discoloration inside the mailbox all pointed to something far darker than lost property. The lab was already working to identify the biological traces in the wood grain. And that letter, the one found sealed inside the bag, was being scanned, preserved, and dissected by handwriting experts. Though unsigned, its tone and phrasing were being cross-referenced with records from the Kleiners. No one had seen much of their handwriting in life, but the county still had their will, a few checks, and old DMV documents. Enough, maybe, to form a match. For the first time in 14 years there was movement. Evidence. Not just speculation or suspicion, but something real. The kind of break that families wait entire lifetimes for. And for Marlene Rayner, sitting alone in a quiet house with a red pen still resting by the calendar, the phone call that came that morning was one she both feared and needed. Her husband's name had been found. And this time, it wouldn't be followed by silence. The house sat quiet when the call came in. Marlene was at the kitchen table with a lukewarm cup of coffee, the calendar open beside her, June already half crossed out. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious, like she expected another robocall or a neighbor checking in. But the moment she heard the voice on the other end, calm, professional, asking if she was still living at the same address, something in her posture shifted. She set the mug down without drinking. The officer explained, gently but directly, that evidence had been recovered from a mailbox on a rural property near Route 9. He said her husband's name was clearly visible on a canvas mailbag found inside. He asked if she could come down to the station. Marlene didn't cry, not then. She just nodded, as if the person on the other end could see her, thanked him softly, and hung up. The silence that followed filled the entire house, stretching down the hallway where Douglas's boots still sat by the coat rack, untouched since the summer of 1980. She walked to the bedroom and opened the drawer where she had kept his letters and route notes, leafing through the pages with trembling hands. There was no relief yet, no resolution, only a heavy shift in the air, like a window opening in a room long sealed. By the time she arrived at the sheriff's office, the scene was already in motion. A federal liaison had been called in. The Postmaster General's office had issued a statement. Old files were being pulled from the archives, dusty boxes stacked in corners where no one had looked in years. The lead investigator met Marlene at the door. He wasn't old enough to remember the case firsthand, but he'd read every page the night before and recognized her immediately. He offered his condolences, then handed her a folder with a photo of the mailbag creased, stained, but unmistakably Douglas's. She ran her fingers over the image like it was made of fabric instead of paper. For 14 years, she'd lived with a question that never softened, and now, maybe, an answer was beginning to take shape. Not in the way she had hoped, but in a way that would finally let the silence end. Back on the Kleiner property, the forensic teams turned their attention to the house itself. The mailbox had cracked open the surface, but the investigators knew that in cases like these, secrets rarely stayed confined to just one place. The home was still filled with old furniture, yellowed wallpaper peeling at the edges, and a faint, musty scent that clung to every room. It looked like time had stopped the day Edna passed. Dishes still sat in the drying rack, and an old quilt was folded neatly on the couch, as if waiting for someone to come back and sit with it. They started with the study. It was a small room off the hallway, lined with shelves crowded with decades of mail, yellowing newspapers, and unopened envelopes bundled with twine. A locked drawer in the desk took only minutes to open. Inside was a small leather-bound journal, brittle with age. Most of the entries were mundane weather, crop notes, complaints about noise from a neighbor's tractor, but scattered throughout were darker passages. Mentions of surveillance. Paranoia about federal workers. Lines like they're watching through the letters, and he asks too many questions appeared again and again, always scribbled in a different, more frantic hand. The entries stopped abruptly in June of 1980. In the attic, they found something stranger. Tucked beneath a loose floorboard was a crate filled with mail-old envelopes from the summer Douglas disappeared. Each one had been sliced open cleanly across the top, the contents still inside. Some were bank statements, others were personal letters never delivered. There were a few addressed to neighbors on Route 9 and one stamped for the county clerk's office. All were from that same week in June. None had ever reached their destinations. The pieces were beginning to align. Douglas had picked up this mail the day he vanished. Something happened between stops, something that made him disappear before he could finish his route. The question now was whether he had read something or seen something that someone had wanted buried. The mailbox had hidden the physical evidence, but it was becoming clear that the motive might have been hidden in plain sight. Right there in the pages people trusted to pass hands unbroken, in a town where one man's routine had simply been too steady to be left untouched. 2 days after the mailbox was opened, a full forensic dig was authorized on the Kleiner property. The house had offered unsettling glimpses into a deteriorating mind, but it was the yard, the stretch of uneven land behind the barn, that investigators kept circling back to. A few of the older deputies remembered stories from the early days of the case, rumors that Douglas's scent had led out past the cornfield before disappearing near the fence line. The same area now sat quiet, under thick grass and broken branches, untouched since the sheriff's department gave up their initial sweep in the summer of 1980. A ground-penetrating radar scan showed anomalies beneath the soil, flat, wide disruptions not natural. When the crew began digging near a moss-covered cement slab behind the barn, they quickly uncovered old bricks, soot-blackened and crumbling at the edges. Beneath them, embedded in compacted dirt, were the remains of a large wooden box, long since collapsed inward from rot and time. Inside the frame were the pieces that confirmed every unspoken fear: scraps of a blue postal uniform, buttons still sewn to fragments of fabric, a rusted watch face, a crushed thermos, and bone. The site was sealed off, and word went out quietly. The medical examiner would need time to confirm what everyone already knew. Douglas Rayner had been buried here, not far from where he made his last delivery, not far from where people passed each day with no idea what had been hidden beneath their feet. Back at the sheriff's office, the recovered journal and its scattered warnings took on a different weight. Investigators began to suspect Douglas might have discovered something that morning. Something about the Clyners, or their mail, that triggered their fear. The entries hinted at old land disputes, unpaid debts, and strange accusations about letters being intercepted or messages being altered. But nothing clear, nothing concrete. Just the ramblings of two isolated minds, spiraling into belief that every envelope carried danger and every knock on the door was a trap. Forensic results would soon follow, but the truth had already surfaced in a deeper way. The quiet, unwavering man, who had never failed a route, had been silenced, not by chance, but by the very people who had built a box strong enough to hold him and a town that never looked deep enough to see it. The lab results came back in early July, confirming what most already knew in their bones. The remains found beneath the collapsed box were positively identified as Douglas Rayner. The dental records matched. So did the fragments of bone tissue cross-referenced with the hair samples Marlene had voluntarily submitted from an old comb tucked in the back of a drawer. The analysis of the uniform scraps further confirmed the timeline. The damage to the fabric was consistent with sharp force trauma, though degradation over time made the specifics hard to pin down. Still, there was no doubt left. Douglas had not run. He had not wandered off. He had been killed, hidden, and left in silence just yards from where his route ended. The coroner's office delivered the news with care. Marlene sat across the table from the sheriff and the lead investigator, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes locked on the manila folder they laid gently in front of her. They walked her through the findings, the confirmations, the process now shifting toward a formal closing of the case. She didn't cry. She had already done all her crying years ago. What she felt now wasn't grief so much as release. A slow exhale after a breath she had been holding for half her life. Outside the office, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, microphones outstretched, voices chasing the story like bloodhounds chasing a scent. A few headlines hit the state papers by morning. Mail carrier, found after 14 years. Mystery of Route 9, finally solved. But for those who had lived with the loss every day, the headlines felt hollow. No headline could capture the way time had eroded the edges of Douglas's memory, or the way a simple canvas bag pulled from a rusted mailbox had reset the course of an entire town's memory. The property was sealed indefinitely. No new owners, no tours. The mailbox itself was taken into evidence, carefully transported in a padded crate to be logged and stored along with every other item recovered from the Clyner home. In time, some would say it should be put in a museum. Others said it should be burned. But for now, it sat in a quiet room downtown, finally empty after holding a secret no one was ever meant to find. The journal found in the desk drawer became the quiet centerpiece of the investigation. It wasn't just a diary, it was a blueprint of unraveling thoughts. Over the span of 2 decades, Silas Clyner had written with an obsessive hand, looping letters tightly across, page after page, often without punctuation or dates. His early entries focused on the farm, maintenance logs, brief notes about equipment or weather. But by the mid-1970s, his writing took a darker turn. He began chronicling what he believed to be intrusions into his privacy. He claimed the government had installed surveillance devices through the rural mail system. That agents disguised as postal workers were watching him, tracking him, encoding threats in the return addresses of envelopes. Investigators brought in a forensic psychologist to examine the journal. The assessment was quick and unsurprising: paranoid delusions, potentially stemming from untreated mental illness. Possibly schizophrenia, worsened by years of isolation and reinforced by his sister Edna's complicity or fear. But the real question was how Douglas had triggered their final descent. The note found in the sealed manila envelope offered a clue. While much of it was fragmented, one line near the bottom had been written clearly and underlined 3 times. "He knows we opened the letters. He saw us." That single sentence, buried beneath a swirl of erratic claims, carried weight. It suggested that Douglas had witnessed something he wasn't supposed to, perhaps while dropping off mail, or noticing bundles that should have been delivered already opened. And if he had questioned it, even gently, that may have been enough to tip a fragile mind into action. Back in the evidence room, officers cataloged the intercepted mail found in the attic. One envelope had originally been addressed to a county auditor, its seal split clean and contents missing. Another contained a check that had never been cashed, dated just 1 day before Douglas disappeared. Taken alone, they could be dismissed. But together, with the journal and the satchel and the mailbox, they painted a picture of fear turned fatal. A routine visit interrupted by suspicion. A confrontation that escalated into panic. And a cover-up, hidden not with cunning, but with silence and time. Douglas hadn't been the target of some elaborate scheme. He had simply shown up as he always did, and knocked on the wrong door one final time. With the forensics complete and the journal transcribed, the case against Silas and Edna Kleiner came into focus like a photograph slowly developing. It would never go to trial. They were both long gone by the time the truth surfaced, but in the eyes of the law, the story had enough weight to close the file with resolution. The Sheriff's Department held a press briefing in late July, laying out the timeline, the recovered evidence, and the motive born not of greed or revenge, but deep-rooted paranoia twisted into violence. A crime of delusion made more haunting by how avoidable it might have been. At the press conference, Marlene sat in the front row, a quiet presence in a sea of flashing cameras and hurried reporters. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was part of the record now. When the sheriff mentioned Douglas's name, it was with a catch in his voice, and when he said the words "remains recovered," the room fell still. The Rayner family had waited 14 years for a sentence that simple. He had not run. He had not disappeared. He had been taken and hidden, and now he had been found. For the Postal Service, it was a reckoning too. A quiet investigation was reopened into how the initial disappearance was handled, especially concerning the Kleiner property. No foul play was found in their early response, but there was an air of regret that followed every internal memo and phone call. The idea that Douglas had been just feet from discovery in those early days sealed inside a mailbox no one had the authority to force open lingered like a shadow over every conversation. Ty returned to Clyde for the first time since leaving at 18. Now in his 30s, he walked the familiar streets with an older man's eyes. He visited the property under escort, standing quietly beside the torn-up soil where the remains had been found. He didn't say much, but when a deputy offered to retrieve anything left in the evidence room that might belong to him, Ty nodded. All he asked for was the thermos, the one from his father's truck. The same one that never spilled, even when left running on the side of the road. He cradled it in both hands like it still held warmth, then turned and walked back to his car as if carrying something finally whole again. The town of Clyde didn't hold a parade or dedicate a monument when the case was closed, but something in the way people moved began to change. Conversations in the diner returned to old stories about Douglas, how he'd help patch a roof if he saw loose shingles while delivering, how he once fixed a child's broken bike chain with the same calm focus he used to sort letters. The silence that had once followed any mention of his name was slowly replaced by memory, steady and clear, like a fog finally lifting after a long season. At the post office they left his locker untouched. Someone polished the brass nameplate. A few of the older carriers hung a small frame above it, a photo of Douglas standing beside his truck in the mid-70s, smiling at something off camera. Beneath it, someone had typed out a simple line and taped it to the wall. He never missed a day. The satchel recovered from the mailbox was returned to the family, cleaned and stored with care. Ty said it would go in the attic for now, but that someday he'd pass it down, maybe with the photo of his father standing in the snow, sleeves rolled up, laughing at something Marlene had said just before the shutter clicked. For Marlene, closure didn't mean the pain was gone, but it was no longer shapeless. It had a name, a place, a reason, even if that reason was madness and fear. She didn't mark the calendar anymore. Instead, she kept a small vase near the front window with fresh flowers and a worn photo of Douglas propped behind them. Every Sunday, without fail, she'd swap out the blooms. Sometimes wild flowers, sometimes whatever was cheapest at the corner store. It wasn't about beauty, it was about rhythm. The same kind Douglas had lived by: route, return, repeat. And the mailbox, the one that had sealed away the truth for 14 years, was crated and sent off to a postal museum out of state, not as a spectacle, but as a reminder. A quiet exhibit marked with a plaque that simply read, "In memory of Douglas Rayner, 1937 to 1980, trusted carrier, loving husband, lost then found." Visitors walked past without always stopping, but the ones who read it never forgot it. The envelope found in Douglas Rayner's mailbag, the one with no stamp, no return address, and no recipient listed, remained one of the more unsettling pieces of evidence. It had been written in a shaky hand, its wording disjointed and erratic, but it held the last real clue to the events of that day. Forensic linguists spent weeks analyzing the handwriting against samples from the Kleiner household. Eventually, they confirmed what investigators had suspected. The letter had been written by Silas, likely in the hours or days following Douglas's death. But what stood out most wasn't what was written, it was that the letter had never been meant to be mailed. It had been sealed and placed in the satchel with care, as if someone believed it would explain everything without having to say a word aloud. The letter didn't read like a confession, it read like a warning. Silas wrote about infiltration, about voices carried in envelopes, about messages from the post office that weren't his to receive. He wrote that someone was watching through the stamps, that Douglas had become suspicious, that his eyes were too sharp and his questions too steady. And then, in one line, he admitted that we couldn't let him keep asking. It was the closest they would ever get to a motive. Not money, not vengeance, just fear, irrational and untreated, growing quietly behind closed doors until it finally took form in violence. Federal investigators agreed the letter should never be made public in full. Instead, excerpts were included in the final case summary, filed with the state records, and sealed behind standard review procedures. It wasn't censorship, it was caution. Some truths, especially those born of madness, don't need to echo louder than the justice they helped bring about. Marlene read the summary, but never asked to see the letter. She said she preferred to remember her husband by the facts that mattered: his loyalty, his routine, his unwavering presence on the route. She didn't need to understand the mind that took him, she just needed to know that the silence was no longer winning. The letter had once been locked away to keep a secret hidden. Now, its words were held quietly, not as an answer, but as a final footnote to a man who had only ever wanted to do his job. Not long after the case was closed, the county held a small memorial service at the local church. It wasn't an official state event, and there weren't any television crews or politicians present, just neighbors and friends and former co-workers who had held on to Douglas Rayner's memory like a bookmark they were never ready to lose. The sanctuary filled with quiet faces, many older now, some carrying their own children, all drawn back to honor the man who had disappeared without a trace and finally come home. The pastor spoke simply. He talked about service, about the dignity of showing up day after day, rain or shine, without applause or recognition. He mentioned how Douglas never missed a delivery, never rushed a conversation, never treated his job like it was just a paycheck. That kind of constancy, he said, leaves behind more than paper trails. It leaves echoes. One of Douglas's former co-workers read a short poem at the pulpit, her voice steady despite the way her hands trembled at the podium. Another stood up unannounced to recall how Douglas had helped her father fix a fence during his break, staying an extra hour just because it felt like the right thing to do. Marlene sat near the front with Ty beside her, the two of them sharing a silence that had softened over time. Ty kept his hand resting on his mother's, steady and warm, the same way Douglas used to rest his hand on the back of her chair during family dinners. When the service ended, they stepped outside and followed a small procession to the post office, where a new bench had been placed beneath the shade of an old elm tree. The plaque was simple. It bore his name, the dates, and the words he carried us all. People laid flowers on the seat. Some left notes. One child tucked a crayon drawing of a mail truck between the slats, and for the first time in years, the route felt whole again. Not because the questions had all been answered, but because the space left behind had finally been acknowledged. In the rhythm of footsteps and the shuffle of envelopes, Douglas Rayner's name would always remain. Not just on the bench, not just on the records, but in the quiet places carried forward by memory. A few weeks after the memorial, a letter arrived at the Clyde Post Office addressed to Marlene Rayner. It had no return address, but the handwriting was careful and neat, each letter drawn with intention. When Marlene opened it, she found a single page inside, typed on an old machine with slightly uneven spacing. It was from a woman who had lived 2 towns over, a nurse at a long-shuttered mental health facility where Edna Kleiner had once been evaluated in the 1960s. The nurse, now retired, had seen the recent news in the paper and wanted to offer something she hadn't realized might matter until now. She wrote that Edna had been brought in for a short-term psychiatric assessment after a reported breakdown on the family property. The records, she said, were sparse, handwritten, and buried deep in storage, but one line had stayed with her all these years. During an intake interview, Edna had muttered, "They're in the wires. The voices come through the stamps." At the time, no one had made sense of it. They chalked it up to stress, maybe isolation. But in the wake of everything that had come to light, the woman couldn't help but feel that warning signs had always been there, quiet, overlooked, tucked between ordinary moments. Marlene read the letter twice, then folded it gently and slipped it into the same drawer where she kept Douglas's last paycheck stub, the watch he'd left on the nightstand, and the small Polaroid of him and Ty standing in front of the truck, both of them laughing at something just out of frame. She didn't need the nurse's letter to understand the weight of what had been missed, but she appreciated the kindness behind it. It was one more stitch in a tapestry, slowly being sewn back together. That fall, as the leaves began to turn, Marlene found herself walking the old route. Not all of it. Just the familiar stretch from the town center past the elementary school and out toward the curve where the fields opened wide. She paused near the fence line, hands tucked into her coat sleeves, eyes scanning the horizon. Nothing about the land looked different. And yet, in the silence, she felt something settle. Not peace exactly, but the absence of unrest. A kind of stillness that only comes when the truth, however painful, has finally been delivered. Later that year, the town council quietly approved a proposal to rename the small loop that passed through the eastern side of Clyde, the one that had once been part of Douglas Rayner's daily route. It wasn't a big road, just a gentle arc through wheat fields and wind-worn fence posts, but it had been traveled by his tires nearly every day for more than a decade. The signs went up one morning, without ceremony, 2 green metal markers reading Rayner Loop in white block letters. Most people saw it as fitting, a subtle way of marking a path that had long mattered more than anyone realized. Ty flew back into town to see it. He didn't make a big deal of it, didn't tell the press or invite a crowd. He just rented a car and drove the full loop with the window rolled down, the warm autumn air moving through the cabin as he passed by fields that still looked just as they had in his father's stories. He slowed near the bend where the truck had once been found and parked along the shoulder, letting the engine idle while he stepped out. The road was quiet. No traffic, no voices. Just the low rustle of wind in the corn stalks. He stood there for a while, staring out across the land, the soft rise and fall of the hills reminding him of the old paper maps his father used to fold and tuck behind the seat. When he finally turned to leave, he looked up once more at the sign. Not because he needed to, just to see it there. Proof that something once invisible now had a name. Back in town, the post office began hosting a small annual event on June 17, not a celebration but a quiet gathering where current carriers could come together, share stories, and take a moment to honor those who never made it back. They called it the Rayner Route Walk. It wasn't publicized, just word of mouth. Each year, a handful of people walked the length of his old path, stopping at the places where he used to linger, mailboxes still standing, porches that hadn't changed. Not for spectacle, but because in remembering the steps he took, they kept his story moving forward, carried along in the rhythm he never abandoned. In the years that followed the discovery, Douglas Rayner's story became more than a local legend. It found its way into postal training manuals, used as an example not of danger, but of quiet devotion of what it means to serve a community even when the job goes unnoticed. At conferences and annual meetings, his name was sometimes mentioned alongside carriers who had delivered through hurricanes or blizzards, a symbol of dedication carried out to the very end. But back in Clyde, his memory remained simpler, woven into the routines of everyday life. The house on the Kleiner property was eventually torn down, too much decay, too much memory soaked into the walls. The county deemed it a liability and leveled it one cold November morning, leaving behind only the open field and the faint impression of where the foundation had once been. The mailbox, long removed and boxed in a museum, was all that remained of the place's strange legacy. The land was never resold. Some said it was cursed, others just let it be, content to let the grass and wildflowers reclaim the space where so much pain had once been hidden away. Marlene continued her quiet life. She never remarried. She kept the house just as Douglas had left it, not out of denial but out of quiet respect. The boots stayed by the coat rack. The faded flannel jacket still hung near the back door. And every now and then, she'd receive a letter from someone she didn't know, a former carrier, a widow from another small town, a young man starting his own route, thanking her for sharing his story. They always said the same thing, that they hoped, when their time came, they could be remembered with even half as much care. Ty visited more often now. Sometimes he brought his own family. His daughter once asked why Grandpa Douglas's name was on a bench and a road and a sign at the post office. He thought about how to answer, then told her it was because he never stopped showing up, even when no one was looking, that some people live their whole lives not for attention or praise, but because it's the right thing to do. And sometimes, those are the ones who leave behind the longest echoes. One afternoon, several years after the case had been formally closed, a high school history teacher in Clyde invited Marlene to speak to her senior class. The curriculum had shifted to include local history alongside national events, and the story of Douglas Rayner had become something the students were eager to hear in her own words. Marlene hesitated at first. She wasn't someone who liked speaking in front of crowds, but something about the invitation felt right. Maybe it was time, she thought, to let her voice be part of the story too. The classroom was quiet when she arrived. No cameras, no news crews, just students in rows, with open notebooks and curious eyes. She didn't read from anything. She simply spoke, told them what it was like to live with silence, with the weight of questions that had nowhere to land. She talked about how Douglas had started as a substitute carrier, how he fell in love with the rhythm of it, how he knew the names of every dog on his route and which porches needed the mail wedged tight to keep it from blowing away. She told them how he used to leave notes tucked into the corners of envelopes if he knew someone was having a hard time. Little reminders that they were seen. When she finished, the students sat quietly for a long moment before one of them raised a hand and asked what she wanted people to remember most about him. Marlene thought for a while before answering. She said it wasn't about how he died, or even how he was found. It was about the way he lived steady, unnoticed by most, and always reliable. She said, "The world keeps turning because of people like that. You just don't hear their names often enough." Afterward, the teacher thanked her and handed her a small binder. Inside were handwritten notes from the students, each one a reflection on what the story had meant to them. One simply read, "I want to be someone who keeps showing up too." Marlene closed the binder and held it to her chest. The story that had once felt like a wound was now something else entirely. Not just a record of loss, but a living reminder of how quietly love can echo when it's finally heard. Every June, as the anniversary of Douglas's disappearance came around, the town seemed to fall into a gentle rhythm of remembrance. It wasn't forced or overly formal, just something that grew naturally, like the way the sun stretched longer across the fields, or how neighbors lingered a little longer on their porches in the evenings. People who hadn't even lived in Clyde in 1980 would pause when they passed Rayner Loop. They'd slow their cars or roll down a window, as if trying to hear something still humming faintly beneath the quiet. One year, the post office organized a letter-writing project for school children. Each child was asked to write a letter to someone who had shown up for them. A parent, a teacher, a bus driver, a nurse, someone whose work might not always be seen, but who mattered just the same. The letters weren't mailed. Instead, they were displayed along a wall in the main hallway of the post office beneath a small sign that read, "In honor of Douglas Rayner, a man who always delivered." The response was overwhelming. Entire classrooms participated. Some adults joined in, slipping in their own letters, unsigned but heartfelt. One simply read, "To the man who left my medicine on the porch every winter. You saved my mother's life and probably never knew it." Marlene visited the display one morning when the office was quiet, just after the mail trucks had left for the day. She moved slowly down the line, reading each letter in silence, her hand trailing gently along the edge of the wall. The final note at the end was from one of the newer carriers. It said, "On the hard days, I think of Douglas. On the quiet roads, I carry his name with mine." Outside, the sky was beginning to warm with the soft gold of an early summer morning. A mail truck rumbled past the window, the same kind Douglas had driven, the same hum that had once been the sound of routine and safety. And somewhere in that rhythm, in the soft turning of tires and the crinkle of paper, there was something still alive. Not grief anymore, not mystery, just a legacy quietly unfolding, one route at a time. Years later, long after the mailbox had been sealed into history and the field had been left to the wind, a small package arrived at the National Postal Museum in Washington, D.C. It came from the Clyde Post Office, carefully wrapped and accompanied by a letter explaining its origin. Inside was Douglas Rayner's badge, the metal dulled by time but still bearing his name etched across the surface. Alongside it was a copy of the original route map, hand-marked in pen, with little circles around the addresses he'd made notes beside. It wasn't meant as a formal donation. It was meant as a gesture, an offering to a broader story, one that stretched far beyond one rural road and one lost afternoon. The curators took it in gently, understanding that some artifacts carry more than history. They carry heart. The badge was placed in a display near a section on Postal Service dedication, next to stories of carriers who had crossed flooded rivers and blizzards to keep their promises. Douglas didn't need a headline. His story spoke for itself in the silence between footsteps, in the way communities remember those who gave without ever asking to be noticed. Back in Clyde, the Rayner home remained standing. Ty helped with upkeep now. He brought his kids to visit in the summers, let them run through the yard where he used to toss a ball to his dad before dinner. They knew his story, not just the facts but the feeling of it, the quiet strength, the steady presence, the way he had looked after people not out of duty, but because it was who he was. And as they grew older, they learned that sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the loudest. They're the ones carried quietly, mile by mile, home by home. Marlene lived to see her grandchildren grow, her grief softened by time and shaped by purpose. In her final years, she said she had no regrets. That justice, when it finally came, didn't erase the pain, but gave it shape, gave it meaning. And in the end, all she had ever wanted was for Douglas to be remembered. Not just as the man who vanished, but as the one who never stopped showing up. And now, thanks to a locked mailbox that refused to stay silent, he always would be.